Bienvenidos. Sorry, I don't speak Spanish. I speak, but I think that won't be a right thing. I might say something offending. So better I will speak in English. I hope most of the people here they understand English. It's absolute pleasure for me to welcome Professor Kavita Singh and all of you in the Embassy of India. There are many types of lectures that we organize in the embassy, but today it is different. Even if you don't understand or don't understand the depth of the subject matter, you can enjoy the paintings. They are very rare. And I come from Jaipur, where there is a tradition of Pichwai and other kinds of paintings, this included. Being a normal man, we don't understand much about paintings. Most of us don't. We appreciate art. If we like it, we say it is good. I enjoyed it. But she is different. Her perspective is different, and we are here to hear something different on these things. She is a renowned art historian, famous for her bold and frank views, including the subject. The Mughal Empire, a dynasty of kings, ruled India from 1526 to 1857. So you can understand over 300 years they ruled India. So it was a dynasty, and they came from the present day Central Asia. When they came, before them also they were Muslim kings, called, that era was called Delhi settlement, and they had a tradition of paintings. As I understand it, that when Mughals came, they mixed with that something which they bought, Persian style. And Persia was, the Persian or Farsi remained India's official language for during all that time, 200, 300, 400 years. It was there until, I can say, till early 20th century. I am from Rajasthan, and Rajasthan was so big because there was no Pakistan. So the Rajputana was almost bordering towards Persia. So today we are here hearing her on Mughal painting between Persia and Europe, because she is now taking into the Western tradition, I think, the comparison and the differences that she is going to tell us. You will see her, she is an expert. I am not an expert, but the only thing that I want to tell you, that paintings, I have seen some of the paintings, they are really rare. So even if you don't understand anything about paintings or Mughal paintings or Western paintings, you are just going to love it. Most welcome, Madam Kavita Singh. Thank you very much.
Buenas noches, good evening. Señor Vishnu Kumar Sharma, primer secretario de la Embajada de la India en Colombia, señora Ana María Present, profesora Kavita Singh, profesores, estudiantes e invitados. Realmente para nuestra Facultad de Artes y Humanidades es un placer darles la bienvenida a nuestra conferencia. Ya han oído el título varias veces. Se trata del evento inaugural de nuestro curso de verano, Arts of the Mughal Empire, Transcultural Encounters and the Compulsions of Cosmopolitanism, a cargo de la profesora Kavita Singh. Este curso se ofrece como parte del programa de arte no occidental que apoya la Fundación Getty a través de la beca Connecting Art Histories que recibió el Departamento de Historia del Arte y la Escuela de Posgrados. Unas gracias muy especiales a María Clara Bernal, nuestra directora de la Escuela de Posgrados, y a Verónica Uribe, la directora del Departamento de Historia del Arte. Este es un programa que ya lleva 2 años, nos ha permitido establecer un espacio para el conocimiento que amplía la historia del arte en Colombia que hemos hecho y que nos caracteriza en la universidad, a través de profesores invitados que ofrecen cursos en áreas que de otra manera no podríamos tener. El año pasado tuvimos el curso de Stephen Nelson de UCLA sobre fotografía africana, luego el curso de arte afrobrasilero de la profesora Juliana Ribeiro de la Universidad de Campinas, y muy recientemente, lo acabamos de cerrar, sobre arte japonés con el profesor Yucho Lipit de la Universidad de Harvard. Queremos que este sea un programa que se extienda en el tiempo para ofrecerles tanto a nuestros estudiantes como a un público externo, por eso hemos decidido hacer estas conferencias abiertas como parte de la inauguración del curso, para realmente apoyar una línea en artes no occidentales y en culturas asiáticas en el sentido más amplio. También me complace darle una bienvenida muy especial a la profesora Kavita Singh por aceptar este encargo, por venir hasta acá. La profesora Singh es profesora asociada de la Facultad de Artes y Estética en la Universidad de Jawaharlal Nehru University en Nueva Delhi. Su investigación gira en torno a temas como la historia de los museos en la India colonial y postcolonial, globalización y museos, repatriación, objetos religiosos y secularización del arte, patrimonio, historiografía e historia de la pintura en las cortes en India. Entre sus múltiples publicaciones voy a nombrar solo algunas: sus libros New Insights into Sikh Art del 2003, Influx Contemporary Art in Asia del 2013, No Touching, No Spitting, No Praying, The Museum in South Asia del 2014 y Nauras, The Many Arts of the Deccan del 2015. Además, la profesora Singh ha sido curadora de distintas exposiciones en el San Diego Museum of Art, la Devi Art Foundation y en el Museo Nacional de la India, entre otros. Así que estoy segura que serán unas semanas muy intensas para quienes estén tomando el curso. Van a quedar sumergidos con tal vez la mejor de las especialistas que hubiéramos podido imaginar traer. Nuevamente, muchas gracias. Gracias a todos y a todas por estar aquí hoy.
Thank you very much indeed. I can't tell you how excited I am to be in Colombia, and I want to really express my great gratitude at the huge privilege that I have of being here today. I would never in the ordinary course of things in my life have thought that I would ever come to this beautiful country. But having come here and having spent a week here already, I have to say I'm absolutely enchanted by it. I'm enchanted by the great natural beauty, the fantastic architectural heritage, the cultural richness, the cultural complexity, and I'm also very impressed by the difficult history that this country has faced and the incredible resilience and creativity and courage of its people that they show in the face of this history, and also the amazing kind of work that has been going on here to repair the urban and the social fabric. And I've been lucky enough to get small glimpses of all of this in the short time that I'm here. So it's a huge privilege for me to be here. It's going to be a visit that I'm going to carry in my heart for a very long time. And so I have to thank Professor Maria Clara Bernal for having initiated the project of bringing me over. I want to thank the Dean Patricia Zalamia and also Veronica Uribe for all that they have done. And there are many, many people in the department who have been working. So I know Lucia, I know Liliana, I know Louise, I know Jennifer, but I'm sure there are others as well whose efforts I've benefited from, and I want to give you my very, very warm thanks. But I also want to tell my countrymen from this embassy how very privileged I am that you thought of extending your gracious hospitality to this event and to me today. And so I want to thank the First Secretary, sir, for his kind and warm welcome, and also my thanks to the Honorable Ambassador who has so graciously allowed this event to happen over here. In fact, though I've only been here for a little while, all the messages I've been sending home mean that there is a stream of requests already from my friends who are historians and art historians and artists, and they're all asking, are there possibilities for us to visit Colombia? So I'm hoping that the embassy will now pick up on some of the leads that I hope I'll be able to bring, and I hope that there will be many cultural interchanges between our countries. I'd like to begin now with my talk, for which I'm going to request that the lights be turned completely off, because we're going to look at a lot of paintings which have a lot of detail in them. And unless the projection is really bright, we won't be able to enjoy them. So can we have all the lights off? Is it possible? Off, all of them off. Yeah, now the screen is shining and we are beginning the talk. So my talk today is on Mughal painting. And as an art historian, I want to focus on one very particular aspect. But I'm aware that this is a field that most of you who are present in this room will not know very much about. And so I want to begin by offering a short introduction to the Mughals, to their empire, and to the times in which they ruled. So can I have the next slide, please? The Mughals were a powerful and a wealthy dynasty that ruled over much of what today is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan, from the early part of the 16th century, as the Honorable First Secretary already told us, till the middle of the 19th century, when the dynasty came to an end at the hands of the British colonial empire. If we look at this map, which shows empires in around 1700, you can see that the peach-colored blob, which is covering most of South Asia, that is the Mughal Empire. Now, let me begin by telling you that at this moment that we are seeing the empire, it had grown to its largest extent. And if we look at the map in this moment, we will see the various empires that are functioning in the 18th century, and you will see things in the Americas that you very well recognize. You'll see that the colonies have already been established in South America by the Spanish and the Portuguese. And further north, in North America, you can see along the eastern seaboard some of the colonies that have been established by the British and the French. But at this point, the empires that you see in the Americas is all that the British, the French, the Dutch had. And in 100 years, these very nations would be able to divide up a great deal of Africa and Asia between them. But at the time that we are going to be talking about, most European countries were of very little significance to the Mughals. Next slide, please. And they mainly saw themselves in relation to and in competition with the other Islamic empires that were near them. And so there was the Safavid Empire in Iran, which you can see as marked green, quite close to India. And then there was the very mighty Ottoman Empire, which we think of as centered in Turkey, but which actually is the large red swath that is covering most of North Africa, all of Turkey, some of the Balkans, and part of Europe as well. So all three of these were Muslim dynasties. And yet all three of them were Muslim dynasties in very different ways. The Ottomans were Sunnis. This is a relatively orthodox form of Islam. The Safavids were Shias. This is a group that had splintered off early in the history of Islam, and it was devoted to certain descendants of the Prophet Muhammad who were martyred. And the Mughals, whom we see as the third dynasty furthest from Europe over here, were also Muslim, sometimes Sunni, sometimes Shia, but they were actually closest to another form of Islam, which is a mystical form, which is called Sufism. And yet, if truth be told, the Mughals actually experimented so much with the other religions that they found, Christianity, Hinduism, that someone from the Ottoman Empire or somebody from the Safavid Empire would not have considered them Muslims at all. They would have thought of them as heretics. Next slide, please. The Mughals ruled from the early 16th century to the middle of the 19th century, and the dynasty was established in India by an adventurous warrior who came from Central Asia. He came south seeking booty and seeking a larger empire. This was Babur, the first medallion that you see on your left. But the rulers that you'll hear about most today are not Babur, but his descendants. His son Humayun, who you see next, his son Akbar, and Jahangir. The monarch who follows Jahangir is Shah Jahan, who becomes the patron of the Taj Mahal, which is a monument that I'm sure you have heard about. But today I'm not going to be talking very much about Shah Jahan. I'm going to be talking about Humayun, Akbar, and Jahangir. Now, under Akbar and his successors, the empire really grew through the 16th and the 17th centuries. In the 18th century, the empire crumbled. But for the time that it flourished, it became a fabulously wealthy empire. And its rulers were responsible for ordering truly remarkable works of art and architecture. Next slide, please. Everybody knows about the Taj, which was a Mughal monument, of course. But the Mughals were prolific builders, and they've left behind a legacy of many magnificent buildings beyond the Taj. Next slide, please. And from the monumental to the microscopic, most of the things that the Mughals used were very finely made and they were very highly embellished. Next slide, please. like the jeweled objects that we see here, where every dagger, every cup, every ornament was beautifully embellished. Next slide, please. The Mughals also had fabulous textiles, and I'm only showing you one tent made of velvet embellished with gold thread embroidery to represent the tremendous textile culture that they had. But the focus of today's talk is on Mughal painting. Next slide, please. And Louisa, you know what to do now. Yeah. And Mughal paintings are mostly found as illustrations to manuscripts. And with their sumptuous bindings, the profuse illustrations, their elaborate margins, the use of luxury pigments like lapis lazuli and gold, these manuscripts also were like books that were jewels. And the art of painting held a very special place in the Mughal court, even though there was something that the very orthodox followers of Islam frowned upon. So Orthodox Islam didn't trust the art of representation, and yet the Mughals were absolutely assiduous in their pursuit of it. Now today I'm going to focus on Mughal painting alone among all the wonderful arts that the Mughals patronized. And I want to focus on one very particular aspect of Mughal painting. But before I turn to the issue that I want to focus on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the development of early Mughal painting itself. Next slide, please. For the Central Asian ancestors of the Mughals, being erudite, being well-read was very important. Being a connoisseur of books, not just of the texts of the books, having a good literary knowledge, but also being a connoisseur of the physical object of the book, being able to appreciate its calligraphy, its decoration, its illustrations, was a matter of great pride. We don't know much about the books that were owned by the first Mughal Emperor Babur, but he was the author of an important book. Next slide, please. He wrote memoirs, which are considered a landmark in the history of world literature. It's an autobiographical book, which is surprisingly frank and honest. And he talks about nostalgia, he talks about his cravings for alcohol, he talks about a lot of very personal things, which you wouldn't expect a ruler to do in a book of that time. Babur's son Humayun, next slide please, the second emperor of the Mughal dynasty, also comes across in history as a very sympathetic figure. He was very dreamy, he was poetic, he was a lover of books and a lover of art. And in fact, he loved books so much that on an occasion when he was at the battlefield and he found that some people had come and plundered his camp and they had robbed his tents of all the money and the treasure that he had, the first thing he asked after was, "Is my library safe?" And when he was told that the books were unharmed, he said, "God be praised that the things that cannot be replaced are safe. As for all the other things, all the jewels and the gold that he had, as for other things, they are a small matter." Right? Because they were replaceable, the books were not. Now this indicates just how important books were to him. But though he was this poet and this lover of books whom we as academics feel very sympathetic towards, he was not a good politician and he was not a good warrior. And it took absolutely no time after he came to the throne for the more politically ambitious figures who were around him to snatch his kingdom away from him. And he had to go from place to place begging for help to try and get some support so he could win his kingdom back. His wanderings were to take him to Persia, to Iran, next slide please, and to the court of Shah Tahmasp, who eventually offered him some money and some soldiers so that he would win his kingdom back. Now the Persian court was always known for its tremendous sophistication, and yet under Shah Tahmasp it was actually at its height of cultural achievements, and the art of painting under Shah Tahmasp was at its dazzling best. How could Humayun not be completely enchanted by what he saw? Among the things that he saw there must have been a great version of the classic epic of Persian literature, which is called the Shahnama, which is a book about the rulers of ancient Persia. There is a very famous version that was made for Shah Tahmasp, which is called the greatest book ever produced in Persian art. And I'll show you a few slides of this. Let's go to the next slide. So here is one slide, and I'm showing you the whole picture and a detail, just for you to get a sense of the liveliness and the unearthly colors that the artist has used. Next slide, please. Similarly, here's another slide with a detail. You can see a dragon is frightening a horse, and you can see the kinds of compositions that the artist used, how the artist likes to show his command over the page, that he has the right to spill over the margins, and the sinuous lines and the fantastic color sense that they have. Next slide, please. Let's look at a third page in a little more detail from this amazing book. This is a page which shows the mythical first king of Persia, who first taught people how to be civilized. They were still living in the wilderness at this time. They wore animal skins, but the artist has placed people outdoors in a rocky wilderness, but he has transmuted this scene of wild and primitive men to one that actually resembles the sophisticated court of the Shah himself. Next slide, please. If we see this detail, for instance, the artist adheres to the idea that people wore furs, but he's turned them into fur coats that are worn over stitched garments. And the rocks have turned into a kind of a hallucinatory palace where the stones turn into shapes that become like a throne for the ruler and become a stool for the minister who addresses him. Now, so enchanted was Humayun by the beautiful books that he saw in the library of the Shah of Iran, that even as he was asking the Persian Shah for money and for troops so that he could go back to India and win back his kingdom, at the same time, Humayun was offering the Shah money to have permission to hire painters from the Shah's court to work for him. What a pleasure it must have been for him then to actually gain a few artists from this court, who would soon make Humayun the subject of similar masterpieces to the ones he saw in this manuscript. Next slide, please. Shortly after Humayun gained a small part of his kingdom, which is a part that is now in Afghanistan, and he settled down in Kabul, an artist called Dost Muhammad made this hallucinatory image for him, in which he placed Humayun in this fantastical alfresco setting, where the Mughal ruler also occupies a throne that is built up of natural rocks. Next slide, please. Here's a detail of the lower part, and you can see that though Humayun's throne is not quite as magnificent as the one we saw in the Shahnama, you can clearly see that there is a back and a seat for the cushions. He is addressing his brother, who's handing him a portrait, and the portrait is a portrait of his little son, who will in the future be the Emperor Akbar. And if we go to the next slide now, which is a detail from the rear of the painting, Akbar is actually playing among the little children over there in the back. I don't know if this is very clear to you, but you can see a bunch of children here who are playing, and Akbar is among them. And the artist has shown Akbar playing in a landscape that is filled with what is called in Iranian painting speaking stones. Stones that are filled with hidden creatures. And if you see the largest of the stones, it actually takes the shape of an elephant. And perhaps the artist is meaning through this to presage the future return to India, which is a land of elephants, and Akbar's rulership over it. Has everyone seen the elephant? Okay. Let's quickly look at another painting that were made for Humayun by his newly acquired Persian artists, just so that we can carry the stylization and the mode of Persian painting of this classic school. We're seeing here Humayun and Akbar, father and son, in a moment of relaxation. On the left-hand side of this painting, there is a double-storied building. Next slide, please. Musicians are playing music, and cooks are carrying food up the stairs in covered trays. Upstairs, next slide please, the pavilion is actually connected to a platform in a tree, and Humayun and Akbar are seated in the tree. Next slide please. You can see a further detail where you can see Humayun and his son. The figures are all very slender in the manner of classical Persian painting. There's hardly a sense of any anatomy of the bodies that are under these lovely clothes. With the exception of Humayun, all the faces are of a type. And instead of focusing on individual portraits or individual moments, this kind of painting is actually supposed to express lyrical beauty through golden backgrounds, through intense coloration, with compositions that are built up of elegant rhythms and patterns. And there is a great interest in bravura detail. For instance, in this painting, the artist is really showing his capacity for miniaturization. I think we have a better detail in the next slide, because the painting that Akbar is giving to his father Humayun is the painting that they are in themselves, right? So it's a painting within a painting that the artist has produced. Now, this kind of work was going on for Humayun with the artist that he had imported from Persia. Pressing further from Kabul, he comes to the plains of Delhi. He reconquers the territory that he has lost, and almost immediately Humayun dies. And his young son Akbar comes to the throne when he is only 13 years old. How such a young boy kept his hold on their fragile power is a story for another time. But Akbar was to grow up to be an even keener patron of books and paintings. And in his early years, the atelier that he supported expanded from a clutch of 3 or 4 Persian artists to a workshop which had more than 100 artists in it. Now these new recruits that he must have brought in must have been local artists who were painting in styles that were practiced in North India before the Mughals came. Next slide please. And those would have been paintings like this, paintings that were made in the service of the religions that were present in India by and large, Hinduism and Jainism mostly. In the early works that are made for Akbar, you can actually see how the local artists are being trained under the Persian masters, and they are learning to adjust the styles that they have inherited to the new standards and needs of their new employer. Next slide please. For example, this is a page from a very early period book that was made for Akbar. It's a book full of stories like the Arabian Nights, and you can see that the gold straight out of Persian painting. Next slide please. And you can see a comparison with the Persian painting to see the stylistic connections. And yet if you look at the woman who is walking with her 2 children below, next slide please, she looks like she has stepped out of a pre-Mughal Indian manuscript. But the next wave of cultural influences that brought into this mix of the Persian and the local pre-Mughal Indian a third stream was not long in coming. Next slide please. This was the influence of European art. Some sources say that Akbar first encountered Europeans in the flesh in the year 1572 when he conquered the port city of Surat. Next slide please. And he met Portuguese traders who were living there. In this painting from an illustrated biography of Akbar's life, we see the ruler in the foreground on horseback, and I put a detail next to it to make it easier to see him. He is about to enter the fort that he has just conquered, and in the crowd that comes to greet him, there is at least one European man. Can you see the figure in the second detail that I have added, which has a black hood, right? Okay, so this is supposed to be a European man, and Akbar is very interested to see that there's a new kind of person around, and he calls him and through interpreter speaks to him and learns that there is a Portuguese settlement further down the coast at Goa. Next slide please. So here is the upper box that's marked here on the west coast, shows you Surat, and the lower box in red, which I hope is visible, shows you where Goa is, where there was a major Portuguese colony. When Akbar heard about the Portuguese settlement in Goa, he sent an embassy there immediately with diplomats and with craftsmen, and he ordered them to bring back knowledge and bring back copies of the wonderful things that they would find there. Next slide please. Click again please. Now the entourage that came back from Goa in a grand procession was dressed in European clothes, and it was playing European musical instruments, and it was carrying objects perhaps like these. Next slide. This cross made of rosewood and ivory. Next slide. A casket also covered in ivory. And next slide. This is just a painting of a musical organ, but we know that a musical organ was carried back from Goa to the Mughal court, and it was played there by musicians. With this encounter began a great traffic in ideas and images and in people and things between the Mughal court and between various European sources: Portuguese, English, Dutch, traders, ambassadors, mercenaries, missionaries. And at the head of all of this stood the Jesuit missionaries who were invited by Akbar to his court. Next slide, please. Where he wanted to learn from them about this religion called Christianity. They brought with them 7 of the 8 volumes of a very famous edition of the Bible that had just been printed in Antwerp. Next slide, please. It was a sumptuous edition, and each volume had frontispieces like this one, or the next slide. This is another one, and the next slide, another one. So these frontispieces actually brought European traditions of naturalism, of perspective, of modeling, of anatomical accuracy for the first time to Mughal eyes. And Plantin's Bible was only to stand at the head of a flood of prints and paintings and books and traveling artists that were to bring European imagery and visual techniques to the Mughal court. Right from the start of this encounter, it seems that Akbar and his son, the Prince Salim, who was to later come to the throne and take the name Jahangir as a king, both father and son showed a huge interest in all of these materials, and they kept asking all the sources, the Jesuits and the English traders, for more and more. And not only did they avidly collect the European material that came their way, but they also set their own artists to work copying prints as a way of imbibing their visual language. Next slide, please. So you have paintings like this made by Mughal artists, which are made in imitation of prints that the artists have seen. Scores of these still survive. Next slide, please. And scholars have also been able to identify the likely sources for dozens of these paintings. Next slide, please. For example, this. The next slide. And so we have paintings that are made after prints. Next slide, please. We have paintings that are painted directly onto prints, where the prints are treated as line drawings, which the artist fills color on. Next slide, please. We have paintings with prints, where the painting and the prints occupy the same page. Next slide, please. And then we even have paintings that try to look like prints, where the artists just use a bit of ink and very light touches of color to create the effect of a European engraving in their completely painted original works. Curiously, there are a number of repetitions when we look at this oeuvre, where 2 very similar versions of the same Europeanizing theme exists, and most of these are by Akbar's most virtuosic Europeanist artist, the artist Kesudas. Next slide, please. So there are 2 versions of Joseph interpreting the Pharaoh's dream by Kesudas. Next slide, please. There are 2 versions of crucifixions, and several such doublings actually suggest that an artist was working for the emperor by day, but was moonlighting, that's sort of working, unofficially, for the prince by night. And indeed, several sources tell us that the Prince Salim was so keen on European style images that he got into a kind of race with his father to collect them. When the Jesuits received an altarpiece from Rome to put up in the chapel that they had been allowed to build, it was a great occasion, and they invited all the high members of the court to come and see it. Akbar made the trip to the chapel, and he was content to very respectfully view it. When Salim saw the painting, he asked if he could take it home for himself. And when a Portuguese Jesuit artist arrived, specially to make paintings for the Jesuit church in the Mughal capital, next slide please, the fathers wrote back to Rome and they complained that they had not been able to use the artist at all, since the prince had taken away the artist and made him do work for him. And so this little painting is actually an oil painting on paper, and it's believed to have been done by this traveling Portuguese artist for the Prince Salim. Now one might ask, why were Akbar and Salim and all the other members of their coterie so enchanted by European art? The Jesuits reported that Akbar treated the Bible and paintings of Christ or the Virgin with great reverence. And encouraged by this, they believed that these images were going to inspire the imperial family to convert to Christianity. But the fact was that the Christ and the Virgin already had a place within the Islamic tradition. Christ is accepted as a prophet who preceded Muhammad, and Mary is honored as his mother. And in the end, we find that the prints that were brought by the Jesuits were to have a lasting impact on Mughal art rather than Mughal faith. And one of the reasons why European techniques of naturalism were so eagerly accepted and copied at Akbar's court was because it coincided with an interest in Akbar's court with documentation and historical accuracy which was developing at the time. About 19 years after he came to the throne, Akbar commissioned an official biography of his reign which would give a detailed account of everything that he did. And a special documentation office was established, and it was supposed to keep copies of every letter and every edict that he issued. And he also got assigned a team of 12 chroniclers who were working in shifts 3 a day to follow Akbar around and to record everything that he said and did. And this then became the material that was handed over to Akbar's official biographer, Abul Fazl, who was supposed to write the authorized biography for Akbar. And in the preface to the biography that he writes, Abul Fazl says that he, for every event that he had not personally witnessed, asked 20 sources so that he got an accurate view. Now, this is an emphasis on eyewitness accounts and on documentary accuracy in texts, which is supposed to set the text that he writes about Akbar apart from the earlier tradition of chronicle writings of sultans and emperors, which were all full of praise and formulae. When European prints and paintings began to arrive at the Mughal court just a few years afterwards, I think they revealed to these people the possibility that paintings could also be eyewitness accounts of events. And the histories that Akbar was to commission for his own life were also produced as very richly illustrated manuscripts. Next slide, please. So, for example, we're seeing one page from the biography of Akbar in which an event from his childhood has been depicted. And we see how the artist tries to, within his capacities, give very individualized faces even to the people you would consider less important on the scene, including the servants and the attendants who are at the margins of the page, as you can see in the detail that I've prepared for you. When scholars consider the impact of European art on Mughal painting, they note that while Mughal painting is profoundly impacted by it, it never fully absorbs its logic. And a lot of scholars then express a slight disappointment with the way in which Mughal artists use inconsistent light sources. They use irregular perspectives, and they have irreconcilable elements within the same painting. For example, in the next slide, we see a painting of a beautiful mother and child, perhaps inspired by some Madonna who has been transported to a Mughal palace. Next slide, please. Her face and her hair and her folds of the dress are so delicately painted. But she is placed on a golden carpet that is so flat that it seems it's going to throw her off the page. Many years later, a Mughal artist was to make a sensitive study of the 3 sons of Shah Jahan. Next slide, please. And the artist is able to capture the individual likeness, not just of each prince, but also of each prince's individual horse. Now, the delicacy of the observation that we see in these portraits, next slide, please, is only marred by his use of a reverse perspective, where the most distant prince is made the largest because he's the eldest of the 3, he's the closest to the throne, and therefore he's the most important, and the one who's closest to us is made the smallest. So scholars have seen things like this, and they have criticized these errors on the part of the painter, saying that the Mughal artist was only intuitively attracted to the methods and the mode of Renaissance art, but he actually lacked the intellectual grounding or the rationality of its principles. And here, after such a lengthy preamble, I've arrived at the art historical question that I want to explore with you today, because many scholars seem to be approaching Mughal painting with the assumption that, having once taken an interest in the mode European, it is somehow incumbent upon the Mughal artist to take the entire Renaissance project on board. And he has to master single point perspective, he has to understand light sources, He has to properly understand the recession of objects in space. In a word, it was the duty of Mughal art to become a provincial form of European art. And so there's an expectation that Mughal painting should have evolved on a linear path. It should have gone from the Persian mode to the European one. And its inability to do so is a failing and a lack. In fact, Mughal painting continually zigzags between a Persianizing mode and a Europeanizing one. Sometimes it will do so within a single painting, where time after time Mughal artists introduce internal inconsistencies in the painting, where some passages are in one style, other passages are in another style within the same painting, and the two styles seem to contradict and undercut each other. Sometimes Mughal painting, having accomplished much in imitating European painting, turns its back on Europe, and it goes back to a strongly Persianizing style. So how shall we see this undulating path that Mughal painting takes? Shall we see these as insufficiencies? Shall we see them as evidence of an artist's naivety? Or should we see these in some other way as arising out of deliberate choices that the artist has made and that are filled with coded meanings that the audience of the time would have known? I'm going to lay out my understanding of the answer to this question in the time that is remaining by considering 4 paintings. One from Akbar's time, 2 from the time of his son Jahangir, and a final one from a later period when the Mughal court has already begun to weaken and Mughal artists have taken their skills to other courts. And I hope that this will lead us to an understanding of what the Mughal artist was intentionally doing as he oscillated between the 2 paths that were open to him. Next slide, please. So here is a text, a painting from a classical Persian text that was illustrated for the Emperor Akbar towards the end of his life. This is a text that deals with the ethics of kingship. And the artist illustrates a story here in which a king tries to make amends after accidentally killing a mother's only son. Next slide, please. So the king offers the mother a choice between blood money and revenge. At her feet, he has placed one golden basin which is full of golden coins, which is offered in compensation. Next to it, there is another empty basin which is there for the king's own head if she should decide to cut it off, and he is offering her a sword to do so. With his growing ability to capture likeness and to render emotional states through visible means of gesture and posture and the expression on faces, the Mughal artist allows us to empathetically feel different things as we course over this painting. Next slide, please. We feel what it is to be so dead that your body could lie on brambles and not be prickled by them. Next slide, please. We feel what it is to be the friends who are caught up in grief and concern for the dead and for those who survived the dead. Next slide, please. And above all, we feel what it is to be the mother on whose face the years have already etched a world of pain. The droop of her shoulders, the hopeless gesture of her hands seem to ask, what is the point of a choice like this? To choose between gold and blood, neither of which will bring back her son? The figure of the mother in the blue mantle, her dead son, the grieving shepherds, they're most probably adapted from a European engraving, next slide please, of a crucifixion or a deposition. And her blue mantle, I'm sure, is meant to remind us of the Virgin Mary, not for a religious reason, but to remind us of motherhood's exaltation and also motherhood's continuous and unremitting pain. Next slide, please. Curiously, the right-hand half of the painting, where the king and his party are shown, is rendered in a much more conventional Mughal manner without the Europeanizing quotation that we see on the left. And although the king's facial expression is solemn, and though his body leans forward a little bit as he offers the sword, his figure is far less expressive than the figures of the victim's side. His clothes, the clothes of his attendants, are conspicuously less modeled than the clothes of the dead man and the grieving mother. Instead, the king and his party have clothes that are flatter, brighter, And they're actually made of more Indian colors. And it's worth noting the two different yellows that are used by the companions on the two sides of the painting, where you see the shepherd in a yellow shirt who's wearing a shirt that's a kind of a lemon yellow. But on the right hand side, you see a more orange hue of yellow. I hope the projection is good enough to differentiate between the two shades. And the shirt that the attendant is wearing on the right hand side is actually painted in a uniquely Indian pigment called gaugoli, which is made by boiling down the urine of a cow that has been fed on mango leaves for 1 month. Yeah? So it's a, so now what might be the implications of this bipartite visual language? This gaugoli is actually associated with the clothes that are painted on paintings of Hindu gods quite often. Many of them wear these yellow clothes, so it's a color that is actually associated with sacredness. So there is something going on in the choice of pigments in the two halves of the painting. To remind us of Akbar, we see a detail of a painting from the Akbarnama, and if we compare the two portraits, I believe they are related to each other. There's a drooping moustache, a typical turban. It seems so, though this might be kind of audacious on the artist's part, because he's putting Akbar then in the role of a king who is fallible and has made a terrible mistake. But this is also a king who is determined to be just at any cost to himself. And so perhaps this subtle shift of registers across the painting is meant to suggest that this court in India of Akbar is actually the locus of ethics and justice in the world. And perhaps the right side, with its reference to European elements, suggests that Akbar's just rulership extends over the whole world, east and west. If I'm right, then Akbar's artists are able to use their expanded vocabulary to produce and explore metaphorical possibilities of this kind of hybridity, where they use the deepened humanism of the Europeanizing mode to suggest the suffering of the people on the one hand, and they use the more formulaic depiction of the emperor to suggest traditions of righteousness that will rectify the suffering of the people. Next slide, please. Now, I already mentioned that Akbar's son, the Crown Prince Salim, was very passionately fond of European art. Even as a prince, he had a workshop or an atelier of his own, and his artists made many copies of engravings for him. And they even captured that Portuguese artist that I had told you about, who had come to the Jesuit mission. Yet, abruptly, for the space of a few years, Salim's entire atelier turned its back on the European mode. Next slide, please. And this was meant to come when I was talking about Salim. So as Jahangir, he's portrayed here, and he's holding a portrait of his father, Akbar. So here we see a painting, which again has a painting in a painting, where Akbar and Jahangir are in dialogue through the means of painting, where an absent person who's already dead is present. Anyway, that's another matter. Now, while Akbar's artists were making drawings like the one we'll see in the next slide, the prince's artists suddenly stopped making things in the European style and started making drawings like the next one. Yes. Next slide, please. So there is no mistaking the return to a resolutely Persian idiom in the portrait that is made for Salim, and several other paintings of this kind are made for him as well. Next slide. Not only do the paintings actually hark back to a Persian style which Mughal painting had abandoned 30 years ago or 40 years ago, but they are actually made by a fresh crop of artists led by one called Aka Riza, whom the prince specially imports from Persia and places at the head of his atelier. And by doing so, Salim is actually mimicking his grandfather Humayun, who had got those great artists from Iran to set Mughal painting on its course. Now the Prince Salim's turning away from the kind of art that was most current and most cutting edge in the royal court. His turning away from the kind of art that he has sought and savoured up to now. And his turning towards an earlier and a very different aesthetic proposition, one that has turned its back on decades of Mughal experimentation with European modes, is related not to a change in taste, but it's actually related to a political development of great importance. The father Akbar and the son Salim had a very tense relationship. And abruptly, in the year 1599, Salim actually raided the imperial treasury, took his troops and the treasure off to a provincial city where he occupied the fort and he declared himself an independent sovereign. Next slide, please. For 4 years, this rebel prince struck coins in his own name and he styled himself as the Sultan. In this place, Salim surrounded himself with a coterie including many artists that drew flattering portraits of their liege. Next slide, please. And they did this in a style that consciously distanced itself from the imperial center. Next slide, please. This magnificent painting, next slide, please, shows Salim seated on an elaborate throne that is considered a coronation portrait that records his becoming a sovereign as a rebel, and it is in a deliberately flat and ornamental style. Eventually, after 4 years, the father and son were reconciled, and Salim did come to the throne. He took the name Jahangir, and immediately, painting under Jahangir, which had so assiduously cultivated a Persian look, turned back to the Europeanizing mode. Next slide, please. Where the Persian artist Aka Riza, whose painting we already saw once before, which is on your left, had been the foremost style while Jahangir was in rebellion, Jahangir now leaves this artist behind in the rebel capital and takes instead this Persianizing artist's son, Abul Hasan, whose drawing you see on the right. And in his memoirs, Jahangir greets this son as a prodigy and says, his father joined my service, but there is no comparison between him and the work of his father. So he much preferred the work of his son. Next slide, please. And the son's work, next slide, is of course in the Europeanizing mode, where you see this drawing that he makes at the age of 12, which is after a crucifixion by Dürer that had arrived at the Mughal court. Now, painting for Jahangir, from the time that he comes to the throne, turns its back on the Persianizing mode as scrupulously as it had adhered to it during the years of the rebellion. And this aesthetic choice of foregrounding Persian-looking art, which was made by the splinter rebel court, didn't necessarily reflect the ruler's personal taste, but it was actually an ideological choice that was dictated by the need to forge a cultural identity that is distinct from the imperial center. And now that Jahangir was the imperial center, this distinction was needed no more. Instead, Jahangir's artists worked hard to explore the possibilities of the European naturalizing techniques while they started illustrating the biography of Jahangir's own life. Next slide, please. In his memoirs, Jahangir frequently describes how interested he is in spirituality, which leads him often to go into the wilderness to seek out ascetics and have discussions with them. And in this painting, the artist called Govardhan is showing the emperor, who actually goes to a hermitage, a cave in fact, where a Hindu ascetic used to live, when the ascetic refused the invitation to come to court, saying courts and royalty don't mean anything to me. Jahangir said, all right, I want to hear him talk, I'll go to him. And so here he is sitting humbly on the ground with this Hindu ascetic. Next slide, please. In the lower half of this painting, we see the portraits, sensitive, precise, of all the courtiers and the attendants and the servants and the grooms that have accompanied Jahangir. Next slide, please. In the upper half, we see atmospheric trees, we see a hazy sfumato of a distant town, we see layered colors, and this again shows the Mughal artist's ability to play with European modes. But just as the painting that we have been seeing so far navigate between the Persianizing and the Europeanizing elements, here too, for all the naturalism that seems to inform the painting, its structure actually adheres to a formula that has been set for the formal audience scenes that are placed indoors in the emperor's court. This would be clear when we see the next slide, please. Here, so you see Jahangir outdoors with the ascetic, and here on the right hand side you're seeing a formal scene of the emperor's court. Next slide, please. And comparing these two, we see how the, back Louisa, back one? Yeah, I just wanted these red lines to come. We see how the attendants are occupying the lower 1/3 of the painting, where the bushes that are screening them off actually perform the same function as the golden railing that is present in the audience chamber, which keeps the lower functionaries at a distance from the throne. The ruler and the ascetic on the left are jointly occupying the uppermost level, which in the painting on the right is analogous to the throne platform. But while the court scene on the right actually has an intermediate zone that is occupied by people of very high rank, in the alfresco scene on the left, this is left empty. And it is as though to suggest that there is nobody present who has a spiritual status that can approach that of either Jahangir or the ascetic. But Jahangir's favorite artist, Abul Hasan, that 12-year-old prodigy who copied the Dürer drawing that we saw a few minutes ago, he went much further in this mode, which marries close observation of reality with messages from the other world. And in what one scholar has very cleverly called the Mughal conquest of Catholic art, all the visual codes and appurtenances that are developed for Christian religious experience now are used by Abul Hasan to clothe the Mughal emperor in an overblown image of magnificence. And this is best seen in a series of what are called dream paintings, in which Jahangir describes the dreams and the visions that he sees, which are then visualized by his artists, among whom Abul Hasan is the foremost. Next slide, please. So one of the most famous dream paintings of Jahangir's era shows Jahangir. Next slide, please. The Mughal emperor. No, Luisa, just go one back. We don't need the detail yet. No, oh, isn't there one with the... Okay, just go to the next one. Okay, fine, my mistake. Okay. So this painting actually shows two men embracing. The man on the right is Jahangir, and the man on the left is the Shah of Iran. By now it is the Shah called Shah Abbas. This illustrates a dream that Jahangir has that comes to him at a time when Jahangir is very tense, because the Shah of Iran is pressing the Mughal emperor over some territorial disputes that they have. There is some land that is part of the Mughal territory, and the Shah says, no, rightfully that belongs to me, give it to me. In this tension, Jahangir has a dream in which the Shah comes, embraces him, says, let us be brothers, bygones be bygones. And Jahangir wakes up absolutely delighted, thinking that this is a good augury, describes it to people among whom his artist is there, and Abul Hasan materializes this in paint, an image of his patron's dream. The Shah and the Mughal emperor are embracing at the center of a halo that comprises the sun and the moon. And it is held aloft by cherubim, and it must be a quotation from a print of Christ as the Savior of the world. Both of these men tower over the earth, which you can see represented as a globe at their feet, though of course it is Jahangir who then towers over the Shah. In fact, the Shah is so small and puny that his arms can hardly encircle Jahangir's waist. And Jahangir becomes the axis mundi that connects the orb of the earth with the orb of the sun. At their feet, Abul Hasan places the lion and the lamb. Next, please. Which are now abstracted from the Christian context where it had been received in the Bible, where it was emblematic of peace under Christ, which becomes emblematic of the peace that has spread through all creation during Jahangir's noble reign. Of course, scholars have noted how it is Jahangir who stands on the lion, Shah Abbas stands on the lamb, and the lion has his forepaws planted firmly on precisely that border territory that is under dispute between them. If we look at this painting, I don't know if I have a further detail. Should we try the next slide? Yeah. If we look at this painting and we see how it has credible portraits, it has carefully rendered clothes and jewels. We have a lion who looks none too happy to be bearing Jahangir's weight. The persuasiveness of the style is actually inversely related to the implausibility of the theme. And the artist is playing a game for us and with us as he uses the tricks of Western illusionism to become and to make us become eyewitnesses to something that nobody can have seen, which is an interior vision from his master's own dream. And yet, here it is in the dream painting that the Mughal artists are drawing most directly from Christian imagery. Not to quote it for what it is, but to use it to apply to their rulers and inflate their magnificence. And the halos and the cherubs and the seraphs and the iconographic devices that are seen in Catholic imagery, which had been imitated just for its own sake under Akbar, is now directly applied to the image of Jahangir. Why? Why is this so? There's a wonderful dissertation by a scholar called Yael Rice, in which she places these dream paintings within a medieval tradition of the interpretation of dreams, where entire books are written about what might be the meaning of a particular sign in a dream. And she says that these speak of dreams as not being fabricated by the dreamer's psyche as we would psychologize it today, but as visions that are sent by God. So dreams become a conduit that allows knowledge and intelligence from the unseen world to trickle into our mortal sphere. But dreams can also be sent by the devil, and they can be sent to lead the dreamer astray. And so illustrating a dream was a very grave task in which a lot was at stake, and paintings that depicted these dreams had to be couched in the language of divine manifestations in order to underline that these are the good dreams, the correct dreams, the dreams sent by God. And what visual schema was available to artists as they set about making paintings that were visions sent by God? Within the Persian tradition, there was already an established iconography that depicted visionary experiences, but this was usually used to show images of the Prophet. Next slide, please. This is an extraordinary image from the Persian tradition in which the Prophet Muhammad is shown speaking directly to God. Now, to avoid the injunctions against portraiture, this artist has worked out a scheme in which he has veiled the Prophet's face, but his brilliance is conveyed through the shooting flames that envelop him. But if Muhammad is touched by light, God is entirely composed of light, and he is those bundles of flames that Muhammad is talking to. This visual vocabulary is already available to suggest holiness, but if the Mughal artist had encroached upon this imagery, which connotes sacredness within their own tradition, and had bent it to the depiction of an earthly emperor's dreams and visions, surely that would be too audacious. It would be suggesting that the Mughal emperor saw himself divine in the way the prophet or God was divine, and this could bring accusations of heresy. And so, eschewing the models of visionary experience that were already provided by the Persian tradition, Jahangir's artists devised visual schema for his dream pictures by taking recourse to another available repertory of images that deal with visionary experiences, and these are the prints that the Jesuits had brought to the Mughals many decades before. And it is these that offer an alternative language that can communicate sacredness without transgressing on the visual codes that have become associated with what is holy in the Islamic tradition. And thus, the Europeanizing mode is used most fully in form and iconography in response to a cultural matrix that is in fact Islamicate, and responds to what that cultural matrix makes possible, a coded language of dreams, and what it prohibits. Next slide, please. So we have seen how Mughal art has chosen a meandering path between Persian and European painting, sometimes citing both in the same image, either to suggest the Mughal king is the ruler of the whole world, or to draw a distinction from the cultural style of father and son, or to fill realistic scenes with symbolic resonance, or to make impossible images appear true. And in doing this, I believe, in mixing and merging and hybridizing and navigating a path that sometimes goes towards one style and then turns its back on it and goes to another, and sometimes making images which hold internal contradictions within each other so that different parts of the paintings play off against each other, the Mughal artists are actually showing us that they don't belong to a style, rather many styles belong to them. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if that overshot the time. Yeah? Yeah, gladly.
Tenemos unos minutos para preguntas. Entonces, ¿alguien tiene alguna pregunta, comentario?
Professor Kavita, I have a very quick question. What was the name of the color that you mentioned?
Gauboli. Gauboli, it's a kind of a, so goli means little balls of pigment and gao is cow. So the dried crystallized mineral that they have produced by this is called gauboli.
Thank you. Thank you.
That.
Sorry for my bad English, but your conference was very interesting, and I think that the ideas that you expressed are very similar to the questions of the colonial painting here
Yes.
at Colombia.
Yes.
So this is also an invitation. I work at the Colonial Museum here at Bogota, and I will be very pleased if you go and show you our colonial painting and also our little collection of Asian objects. We have a lot of ivory, so maybe
I
it
would
will
be
be
thrilled.
interesting for you to see
I would be
that.
thrilled, absolutely, and this would be a great opportunity for me to learn something because I'm delighted. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thanks for your talk.
Any others? Mr. Sharma, I think you promised cocktails and everybody would much rather have them than ask questions.
Thank you very much. It was really very interesting for me also. I just wanted to ask, maybe it is not related with this, but the Kishangarh Shailee paintings, etc. Do you think that they also have inherited something from
Yes.
Mughal Shailee?
Yes, they have actually. So the whole tradition of painting in the Kishangarh court is actually asking about a tradition of painting near his hometown in an area called Kishangarh. That tradition actually started when two important Mughal artists moved from the Mughal court in the 18th century when there was a lot of disturbance over there, and they went to Kishangarh. When they began painting in Kishangarh, there was actually almost no difference visually between what was being painted in Delhi at that time and what they were painting in Kishangarh. So the subjects were different, but the style was the same. 2 generations later, you have this amazing Savant Singh, the prince, who you must know very well. And when the artists are working for him, he was madly in love with a very beautiful dancing girl, and he somehow thought that their love story, because he was also a big devotee of a god called Krishna, about whom there is a lot of legends about his love for a girl called Radha, and their love is seen as a kind of a spiritual thing. So he thought that his earthly life was like a mirror of what Krishna was doing, right? And then Savant Singh's artist started modeling the faces, and particularly the eyes, which are very stylized, on an icon that he used to worship. Which is why at that time Kishangarh painting changes style, and from being the late Mughal appearing style, it turns into a highly stylized thing where you have these very elongated and sharp eyes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Kavita, thank you for a wonderful talk. I want to ask you briefly, you mentioned all of these influences, the missionaries, the Portuguese, the diplomats, the travelers in general. And I was wondering when you mentioned the Dutch, if there's much evidence, and here we can see, especially in the third image, of how landscape operated here. Because you talked a lot about the modeling of the faces, some of the perspective, some of the scale, but landscape is also one of the genres where you can really see the idea of territory, the idea of empire. So if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit on, maybe, if you want
No, this is something
of how
that
landscape
is...
operated, because This third image is amazing, the way that landscape kind of goes off into the distance, and then you have the other symbolic image.
So even in not the first image that's here on the left is not the best example, but other paintings from the same manuscript also have these infinitely receding landscapes, and they very much show the God's eye view. And there is a wonderful scholar from Vienna called Ebba Koch who has done a lot of work on this area, and she certainly speaks about how this is part of the commanding vision of the emperor, and it is a depiction of vastness of territory. And typically at the edge of those paintings there is also the water body, and it has a ship. So there is this connection to lands, that are beyond the lands as well. So there is something to do with territory over there, which is, I think, a little easier to see. If I saw those paintings, you would find, tremendous resonance with what you're speaking about. Interestingly, in the time of Jahangir, whose this painting we're seeing, I'm not sure what would have been the sources for the way the distant town is rendered over here, because it's hazy, which is not a technique or a mode that you would have got through prints, and I don't know how many paintings traveled. When we see Akbar period paintings of distant landscapes, everything is crystalline and clear till the end, and that's because it's being taken from prints and it's being taken from a linear form. I don't know what they would have seen in order to create that, but they would have seen something, and the English travelers particularly had access to English miniatures of the early 17th century. In fact, it's kind of funny because these guys are always asking all the European travelers for more and more paintings, and the East India Company wants to save money, and so they send the worst quality. And when Jahangir sees these paintings, and he's a great connoisseur, when he sees this, he says, you must come from a very little country with very little power if this is all that your king can offer to me as a gift, And then this particular trader, having heard of this, is prepared. He is a relative of, who is the most famous English miniaturist, Oliver Isaac? He's a relative of his. So he gets at a discount paintings from him to gift to the emperor. So that is something that we know about 17th century paintings traveling from Europe. I'm not sure about larger ones, but some of the Dutch traders' accounts actually speak about how what the kings will like are canvases that show battles in which the landscape is well depicted, because they like to see everything up close. They want to see a lot of detail. So, but we don't have paintings surviving which would tell us that this traveled. Any others?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Los invitamos a permanecer un momento más, que vamos a tener unos pasabocas y unas bebidas para celebrar la bienvenida de Kavita. Gracias.